welcome back to episode 3 of the Geopolitical Review, where I sit down with leading experts and scholars to discuss the geopolitical forces shaping the world today. As always, this project is supported by the Democratic Security Institute, a non-partisan think tank dedicated to advancing peace, democracy, human rights, and conflict resolution. In today's discussion, we ask, what if the way we fight for peace is actually preventing us from achieving it? That's the question at the heart of the conversation on prefigurative pacifism. At its core, prefigurative pacifism argues that peaceful ends cannot be achieved through violent means. Instead, it suggests that to build a more peaceful world, we must embody those values in our actions today. It's an idea that raises some difficult questions. In a world shaped by wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere, can nonviolence be an effective response to aggression? Is pacifism a realistic political strategy or a critical vantage point? And what does it mean to prefigure peace in an international system that often seems defined by conflict? To explore these questions and more, I'm delighted to be joined by Borislav Tsokov, who is an associate lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in international relations. He teaches international political theory, political leadership, and chaos and world order. His research focuses on resistance, political action, peace, and pacifism. His doctoral work explored the relationship between everyday and collective forms of resistance. And before joining St. Andrews, he held teaching positions at the University of Stirling and Teesside University. So I hope you enjoy the discussion. Okay, perfect. So, hello, thank you for joining me. I wondered if you could start off by giving a brief introduction of yourself and kind of what your journey has been and how you've managed to specialize in the area that you have.
Yes, hi Grace, thank you for the invitation. So my name is Dr. Borislav Tsokov, and I'm an associate lecturer at the School of International Relations in the School of at the University of St. Andrews. And my research interests, let's say, have been evolving since I finished my doctorate degree 3 years ago. I was, and still am, I suppose, initially interested in alternative ways that we can perhaps conceptualize political action, which has kind of wider implications for resistance studies, civil resistance studies. And in recent years, I have kind of moved and tried to apply these more abstract forms of thinking to perhaps reviving with some colleagues across the UK and obviously beyond the UK, reviving the political relevance of pacifism as a rather marginalized tradition within the humanities, which obviously includes political science, international relations, but also political theory and political philosophy. It's been an interesting journey, I suppose. I've always been interested in resistance, I suppose, from a younger age. And during my doctorate degree, I became increasingly interested in questions of passivity, or let's say refusals or withdrawals, and how, or if at all, how can refusals or withdrawals or passivity in general serve as a political act, as an act of resistance, which is, as we go by in the conversation, I imagine these things will pop up again, but traditionally within the literature of political theory and resistance studies more broadly understood, questions of refusal or withdrawal are seen as apolitical or nihilistic, so not necessarily having any impact on politics. So I'm trying to tap into those questions and with my recent work, applying those questions to pacifism and trying to rethink the tradition.
Yeah, perfect. Well, you wanted to speak, when I asked you what you wanted to cover, you mentioned prefigurative pacifism. Obviously, I've
heard of pacifism, but prefigurative pacifism was new to me. So just to go back to the basics, what on earth is prefigurative pacifism? What does it actually mean, and how does it differ from traditional understandings of pacifism?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is perhaps inspired from an article that I recently published, in which I try to apply some of these um, reflections on passivity to the tradition of pacifism. And obviously, these are not necessarily new ideas. There have been others who have kind of acknowledge this prefigurative logic in pacifism, and some who have more explicitly perhaps written on the conjunction between prefiguration and pacifism. But what I try to do is to offer perhaps one of the few sustained ways of rethinking pacifism within these kind of debates, because traditionally pacifism as a tradition is associated as a moral or ethical stance, and usually it's mostly kind of engaged with in debates around the ethics of war or the ethics of violence. Um, Whereas I try to rethink it as a mode of resistance as well. So something which goes beyond simply an ethical stance on kind of debates between realism, just war, and pacifism to something which is actually enacted as a form of resistance. I mean, there's two main kind of purposes or motivations perhaps behind these attempts. It's on the one hand, again, as I mentioned, to perhaps demonstrate the political relevance of this tradition, because for those of you for your listeners who might be familiar with pacifism, they would know that it's been a very marginalized tradition within the humanities. And also to perhaps, if people were convinced by these ideas, to perhaps try to apply them to, let's say, particular movements or intentional communities, which have often been dismissed as apolitical or nihilistic or utopian. And I think there's, through this lens that I'm proposing, I think that there's a lot that we can learn about violence, how perhaps to overcome violence, and many different tactics and ways of life, even, which can help us deal with some of the issues that we're facing today.
So the kind of core idea is you obviously have pacifism, which would be non-violence as a mode of resistance, and then you have the prefigurative element, which is that the means of achieving a peaceful society should reflect the peaceful society. So you
Yeah.
can't use violence to create a non-violent society. Like,
Yeah. Maybe I didn't fully address the last question. So basically, what prefigurative politics is, it's a study. It's usually associated with anarchists thinking, which proposes a different form of resistance. So things, movements, or perhaps even intentional communities. There's been a lot of research on intentional communities around prefigurative politics, in which activists, instead of following this traditional strategic, let's call it, formula of resistance. That is, we employ certain means, whether violence or non-violence, in order to achieve particular ends, whether revolutionary or reform. In prefigurative politics, these means and ends coincide in action. So it usually involves activists perhaps changing the habits that they have, changing their ways of life in order for the ends that they see in the world to coincide with the means that they're employing to achieve them. So I don't know what would be a good example. I don't know, there's a lot of work, let's say, in climate crisis research on how do we resist the climate change. Obviously, we have the approach where we can gather, resist, organize, challenge, let's say, oil companies or boycott particular consumption practices, but others, for example, prefer to change their everyday habits and, I don't know, consuming less, not buying fast fashion, recycling, if you wish. So they envision a more eco-friendly future by enacting it at the present rather than simply challenging or gathering or protesting against whether a government or a particular company. Does that kind of help too?
Yeah.
So with pacifism, I'm trying to say that a lot of these pacifist thinkers and movements and communities throughout history have been motivated by the same logic of acting. They're kind of withdrawing, whether from society or withdrawing from politics as we understand them, in order to enact alternative visions of the future in the present. And maybe we can go into more examples later on.
So when I was doing some research, obviously a major central figure to pacifism is Gandhi. He treats nonviolence as like an active political struggle where obviously your political action of nonviolence helps you achieve the ends of a nonviolent society. And this kind of non-cooperation with violence or non-cooperation with violent structures is a core idea. So withdrawal or non-cooperation is not a kind of do nothing, but an action in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, but for many, withdrawal sounds counterintuitive. So what are we missing when we equate action with activity? And how do you distinguish between meaningful withdrawal and simply opting out of society?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing in Gandhi as well, because I think Gandhi is an excellent example of what your question taps into. So obviously with Gandhi we have this idea of satyagraha, which I mean, in the West, we usually translate as non-violent action, non-violent resistance. But for Gandhi, Satyagraha was way more complicated. So it was more of a philosophy of life or a way of life, and to become satyagraha, to have this soul force, as it is in certain translations, activists had to change a lot of their habits or their everyday activities. Usually these satyagrahis would be trained, if you wish, in the ashrams that Gandhi started all across India as well as Africa. So it is a good example of how a satyagrahi would withdraw, let's say, from everyday life or politics as we know it, go through these different habits, practices, and sacrifices in order to develop this soul force that Gandhi saw as necessary for the success of nonviolence. Because obviously with Gandhi we have a lot of success of nonviolence, obviously the salt marches and many other different examples of where he managed to succeed with nonviolent means. But the question of what is the difference between withdrawal, which is apolitical, and withdrawal, which has political implications, I think Gandhi serves as a good example here, because for the success of these satyagrahis, they had to, one way or another, withdraw from politics and from everyday life, cultivate new forms of habits and forms of life, and then go and protest and be able to endure the violence inflicted onto them, and so on and so on. So I don't know if this kind of answers the question, but it's a difficult question. I mean, of course, we have many movements or intentional communities who simply withdraw from politics, don't necessarily engage with politics or want to enact their change. But we also have a lot of pacifist communities who are actively involved in changing politics, writing, teaching, translating work, especially in that in Europe in that interwar period between the First and the Second World War, pushing for governmental reforms, organizing kind of strikes against military conscription, and so on and so on. So yes, it's a thin line, but that's what I'm also interested in, kind of trying to show that these intentional communities informed by pacifist ethics have had a significant political influence, even though they might not necessarily be part of political life as we know it.
So when we talk about the means having to match the end, why do you why is that such an important tenet? And
Mm-hmm.
because that is pretty much what distinguishes it from traditional understandings of resistance, that people would use violence to, in like an anti-colonial struggle, to try and achieve a more peaceful society where they're not oppressed by a colonizer. But
Mm-hmm.
do they believe that it's so important to enact that kind of action in their form of resistance?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So, I mean, there's a lot to this. So, first, on the thing about means and ends in action is that it's always contingent, right? And the although I believe this logic of prefiguration has been around for many years, maybe thousands of years in the history of philosophy, maybe in ancient Greece, but prefigurative politics as a field of study, let's say, largely emerged in the 60s, 70s of the 20th century. And this is because of the failures, let's say, of a lot of the revolutionary projects of the previous century. Here we think about the socialist and communist revolutions, which had the same promise, right? We will start a violent revolution. Violence is justified, it serves history, but also because violence is inflicted onto the proletariat. So we will achieve this peaceful socialist society through a violent revolution. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when news started coming out of the Soviet Union and China with Mao, it became obvious that this was not necessarily the case. And a lot of theorists started to think through this relationship between means and ends. And one of the, I would say, most important critiques that comes from that existentialist period is that the relationship is contingent. We don't know if we employ violence, whether the ends that they achieve are going to be peaceful. So I think the means and ends, when they coincide in prefigurative action, it kind of solves this issue of contingency. In other words, there's no leap of faith, if you wish, because the society that you build today reflects on the means that you use to achieve it. So the more difficult part here comes with post-colonial, perhaps, movements and so on. And I mean, I'm no one to judge. I mean, even when you teach these things, it's difficult um, to address such questions. And I'm again no one to judge. I'm not a purist. I still think that maybe in some situations violence could be justified. However, even post-colonial or even decolonial um, scholars like Fanon, for example, who obviously glorifies violence, sees it as purifying. Even they, in their writings, acknowledge the negative ramifications of enacting violence. And I think Fanon is a great example here because he was obviously also a psychoanalyst. He had sessions with perpetrators of violence and in that chapter 5, I believe, in The Wretched of the Earth, he goes over how the enactment of violence leads to its reproduction in everyday life, and so on and so on. So I think I'm not going to be that far as to condemn all violence, but even if your listeners are not convinced of kind of an absolute pacifist position which rejects violence even in self-defense, at least I think engaging with this type of thinking can tell us a lot about the decisions we can take in how to resist and so on. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah. So like you mentioned, particularly with anti-colonial struggles, many political movements obviously have used violence to try and achieve political change. And I think in this country, you could use like the suffragettes using violence to try and achieve the right to vote for women. So do you believe, if you're not taking that kind of absolute notion that about non-violence, do you think violence can genuinely be transformative?
mhm.
Or does
Yeah.
it tend to reproduce that system of violence just in a different form?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think our whole world as we know it now is based on violence some way or another. Could it be transformative? It could, I suppose it could, but again, there is this idea of contingency as well. We can think of many successes of violent struggles, well, relative successes, I suppose. But we can also think of many failures in violent movements. So I suppose, as I said earlier on, I'm not a purist, but I still think even if we see the utility of violence in certain cases, still engaging with pacifism helps us perhaps see some of the implications of resorting to violence, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know if that's a cop out or not, but
Just to kind of come off of what you've just said, if we're talking about the suffragette movement, which did use violent means, and then you had the suffragist movement, which didn't. They relied a lot more on pamphleting or lobbying of MPs and things. One of the arguments at the time was that suffragist non-violent means are too slow, not guaranteed to succeed, and you're relying on those who do have power to readjust the system, which would not necessarily be in their favor. So how would you explain or encourage people to use pacifism, or how do you respond to the critique that pacifism is too slow or it's not guaranteed to work?
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. It's not a new critique, of course. So I mean, in recent years, there's been a lot of research on the efficacy, let's say, of nonviolent resistance. And for example, Erika Chenovet is kind of a leading scholar in these, I suppose, efforts to show the efficacy of nonviolence. And actually, nonviolence is proven or empirically proven, let's say, that it could be effective in certain situations. It's, of course, the idea that it's not quick, it's not effective, that perhaps it's complicit with the oppressor, that it's easily co-optable by different interests. These are well-known critiques of the tradition, not just pacifism, but also nonviolent resistance. And I mean, sure, I can agree with these critiques, but at the same time, choosing a nonviolent method of resistance in certain situations might prove to be more effective in the long run, rather than succeeding some sort of short gains. And obviously, it's very context specific, case by case. With the suffragists, civil rights movements, obviously we have Martin Luther King, and then we have the idea that Martin Luther King wouldn't succeed without Malcolm X or the Black Panthers and so on and so on. So these are very context-related questions. Yeah, I guess we'll never know. As you said, that's why I think even if your listeners are not convinced by this, at least I think these nonviolence kind of ideologues of nonviolence can tell us a lot about the effects of violence or the ramifications or the risks of employing violence, and maybe even kind of limits, if you wish, the violence that we enact, because we would know what the effects of it might be. Does that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Do you think that then the limit of non-violence is using violence for self-defense? So my kind of idea being that Ukraine has obviously struggled from a full-scale invasion from Russia since 2022.
Mhm.
The idea that they would not use violence to defend themselves seems crazy. That they have to in order to stop, obviously, their sovereignty being taken from them and then becoming a vassal state or an extension of the Russian Federation. So how does that fit? Would you say in that context then violence would be necessary?
Yeah. So obviously we're moving towards a field of using pacifism as a moral or normative stance in this kind of ethics of war debate. I think if obviously there is a case for a just war, I think Ukraine's war for just for self-defense is a good example of a just war. With the world that we live in now, it's difficult to be a pacifist in Ukraine, I suppose. But also, that's what I meant earlier on when I said, even if your listeners are not convinced by the absolute pacifist arguments, I think there's still a lot to learn from these pacifist traditions. For example, questions of how does this end, right? How do we, even if we achieve peace, would that peace be sustainable if violence is kind of reproduced through in the coming years? Also, larger questions of the current tendency of European states, not just European, but also Western states, to rearm themselves, increase of military budgets, securitization discourse, what might come out of this, what are the non-immediate, let's say, suffering of people, cuts on healthcare budgets, education budgets, and so on and so on. So a lot of these questions have been explored by pacifist thinkers. And even though I believe that Ukraine's war of self-defense is an example of just war, we can still use some of these critiques of violence or militarism that pacifists level to ask questions about what comes next.
So I suppose my question is, as you say, the world is marked by quite a significant amount of violence at the moment. Can in terms of prefigurative pacifism, then is it more of a idea that would be embodied by smaller sub-state units, like on an individual level or a community level, rather than necessarily a state level when it comes to self-defense? Or like a lot of people would argue that every state should have an army that's capable of enacting violence. So is it that prefigurative pacifism is more at the communal level, and then those values would translate to broader society?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, yes and no, I suppose. I mean, kind of the case study that I was looking at in my paper is of a Bulgarian, I'm Bulgarian originally, community which was inspired by the works of Lev Tolstoy, also Gandhi there as well. And usually in these kind of absolute pacifists philosophies, let's say, the question is the question of peace is peace and war, violence and war. War is not treated as kind of a arbitrary event that just happens in the world, right? War is treated as a social problem, as a social result, as a result of social relations. And these kind of, I suppose, one of these pacifist philosophers will respond to you by saying that in order to successfully enact, let's say, these ideas, we need to treat the social conditions which lead to war in the first place. Does that make sense? So it does sound idealistic, and again, in the world that we live in today, I wouldn't blame your listeners to not being fully convinced by this. But again, I think a lot of important questions come up of this line of thinking. If, for example, the current increase of militarization, military spending, security budgets, and so on. I mean, I think the risk there is that the discourse that we hear on the news every day, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at one stage. And I think that from a pacifist perspective, addressing these conditions that lead to the occurrence of war as a social phenomenon can perhaps help us think through these important questions. Does that again answer the question? I'm not sure.
So if we take money away from the welfare state, for example, and then we put it into military spending, that actually on a societal level, we're reproducing conditions that are conducive to violence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
But yeah, and also, no, I mean, obviously there's other not that immediate effects of war and suffering. I don't know, let's take the Middle East, war in Iran as well, obviously ecologically, purely from the use of these weapons. And not that immediately, let's say, a lot of European, even the EU is turning back to crude oil to kind of catch up with for the lack of, for the decrease in oil transfer from the Middle East. So there are many other effects of war which we don't immediately feel just on the battlefield. So yeah, and I think a nonviolence/pacifist perspective can help us see these, and perhaps again, if not convinced by the absolute pacifist position, at least use these reflections as a critical vantage point if you wish to ask these questions.
So for example, in particular parts of the world, and they're thinking of doing it here with North Sea oil, is that there are particular countries moving back to coal in order to produce enough energy to open and sustain AI data centers. This is completely off topic. But how would a prefigurative pacifist go about resisting the use of fossil fuels for AI data centers, or generally the use of fossil fuels? What would their resistance actually look like? Like, how would that manifest? Would it just,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I suppose there's two things here. Obviously, as I said, for these movements, so usually absolute pacifist movements, they are on the one hand they treat war as a social condition, not simply an occurrence that tends to happen, but also they have a very broad understanding of violence, right? Violence is not simply physical killing or and so on, but it's also structural. It's exploitation, it's inequality, it's I don't know, unequal rights, and so on and so on. So I guess with the AI data centers, and going back to this idea of means and ends coinciding in action, I suppose the answer would be to limit or refuse to use AI in order to interrupt the reproduction of this cycle of exploitation, whether environmental or human. Yeah, because I imagine there's a lot of human exploitation there as well. So, for example, the community that I was looking at, they argue for vegetarianism as an ethical stance because obviously not simply because it's unethical to kill animals, but also that people should rather consume the food that they produce themselves, because any purchase, let's say, of non-self-produced foods involves some sort of exploitation of workers and so on and so on, which of course is a bit too radical, I suppose. There's two sides to this coin. I don't think people should feel individually responsible for these things, but at the same time, again, even if you're not fully convinced, by looking at how this cycle of violence is reproduced in the everyday, we can at best become more conscious of the things that we do.
So
Because, yeah.
you think then that the value of prefigurative pacifism in today's society is more to raise awareness of particular forms of violence that people don't necessarily think about, rather than, oh, you need to become fully vegetarian and live off
Mhm.
your own land and produce your own food? Is it
Yeah.
more they're, they're
That's a
more
good.
forms of resistance that is just to raise awareness to other people of
Mhm.
the reality of violence and
That's a really good question. I mean, here maybe I'm being a bit inconsistent because I am educated and trained, I suppose, in kind of a continental tradition, Marxist, uh, post-Marxist thought, and there is a Marxist critique of these type of arguments that we as citizens, individuals, should not fall into this logic of taking personal responsibility for the ecological crisis or for something else. Because obviously there's um, the owners of the means of production are obviously the ones who actually have an effect on these issues, whether ecology or war. But so I also don't think we should return to living and not embrace technological changes. But at the same time, I mean, going beyond pacifism here in terms of the climate crisis, at the same time, things will have to change, whether we like it or not, whether forcefully or voluntarily. So I think the fact that things will have to change speak for the importance of this prefigurative forms of action, right? So if you want to consume fast fashion, sure, do it, but at least know that when you do, you are exploiting, let's say, workers in developing countries. You are contributing to um, kind of the exacerbation of the climate crisis and so on and so on. And I think that's what I mean by employing these as a critical vantage point. I think even if you're not fully convinced that you should stop eating meat, you should produce your own food, you should live outside of the big city and not use AI, at least through this prefigurative pacifists, there are many prefigurative pacifist moments, I suppose. From them, we can learn what the implications of our everyday habits might be, and then everyone can make a choice.
I think the goal then, it seems, would be to obviously encourage people to change their habits, obviously, towards whatever the goal
Mhm.
of that individual society or movement would be. Do you think we underestimate the political significance of everyday habits and lifestyles because they don't resemble traditional forms of activism? Because kind of like what you've just said. It's that, well, what could I do to change the climate crisis if AI is consuming all this energy, or these big capitalist structures are reproducing things that are damaging for the environment. Me switching off my lights and recycling isn't going to have that much of an effect. Do you think that we underestimate how important it is to act on an individual level, I suppose?
Yes, I guess that kind of fades off to what we just discussed. I think purely on the side of academia and research, there is a resurgence of research on the importance of the everyday, if you wish. Again, going back to that time period of 60s, 70s and onwards. Again, I'm split on this question. Again, it's I also don't think it should be, when it comes to recycling, turning off the lights. Obviously, it has an effect. I don't think you should feel personally responsible to do that, considering others. But when it comes to this idea of enacting the change that we want to see in the present, I think a change of habit and a way of life can prove more sustainable for achieving long-term gains, rather than again going back to this strategic line of thinking. We employ violence or non-violent means, and we achieve particular political ends. So, is it underestimated? I don't think so, purely academically. Outside of academia, I think I guess people, do they pay attention to um, their activities and what the implications of them are? I don't know.
I don't think so.
No? All right. Well,
I,
then, yeah, I think dieting is always a good example, right? I mean, if you want to diet for health reasons, let's say, it's not a means to an end. You need to develop new habits. You need to, one way or another, kind of start living your life in a different way, more in line with a more healthy lifestyle, instead of using, let's say, certain medications or something just to achieve a particular end. I think that's a good example. In long term, I think
yeah,
it's more
yeah,
more effective. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I've just got a few more questions.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
One of the questions I wrote down was that, do you think there are any aspects of modern life that you see as quietly reproducing violence in ways that people overlook?
Yeah, yeah. I think we touched on this. I think the fast fashion industry is a good example of this. Obviously, I suppose the more liberal slash conservative argument is that um, kind of exporting goods from developing countries is good for their economies and so on and so on. But I mean, if you watch a few documentaries on thrift shops in developing countries, you'll see the kind of the working conditions um, that the clothes that we wear in the West are produced in. And obviously, I think going back again to these kind of absolute pacifist communities that I'm interested in, again, they see violence as not simply physical, but also structural and more broad. So we can apply that to many everyday activities that we engage with. Consuming fast fashion, I suppose. Some have made arguments for fair trade products. I suppose um, if we talk about war or militarism in more general, it's highly embedded in our everyday life. You see ads on Netflix now about the British Army. So some of the most played video games, let's say, are funded by the U.S. Army. Some of the highest budget movies in recent years have been funded by the uh, military complex, industrial complex. So we can, when you start noticing these things, you can see how ideologically perhaps they are embedded in our everyday life too. Even media, I mean, with the war in Iran, you see videos of rocket strikes, and it's becoming more normalized in your everyday existence. So how do you resist that? Again, you might choose to refuse, to withdraw, critique from that position. If you're not convinced, then simply engaging with these thinkers, I think, is a good way to notice these things, or allows you to ask questions.
So I would fully agree with you that it does seem that war and violence are normalized, particularly when you kind of define violence more broadly in terms of environmentally, or in the fast fashion industry or consumption of meat, pretty much every area of somebody's life. Do you think that makes prefigurative pacifism more relevant today, or do you think it makes it more difficult? I feel like a lot of people have quite pessimistic view, like a pessimistic view of
Yeah.
pacifism, that it is this like marginalized idea. Do you think that it's more relevant now more than ever, that because of the normalization of war and violence?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the war and violence have always been part of everyday life. I don't think it's much more different than years ago. I just think that now we have the social media and information travel so quick, and there's different ways you can present this and capture someone's interests. And yes, I think very, very hard to. We live in a world where, we have certain world leaders bragging about military strikes, abducting other leaders in front of the whole world. I mean, this is unprecedented, I think, in world history. So uh, we obviously more geopolitically evident, I suppose, or the beginning of a shift to a multipolar world. And usually in history, these things become violent at some point. So it's hard to think about pacifism in these terms. I again, maybe for the third time, I would understand if your listeners are not fully convinced by this, but at the same time, I think it's exactly in these situations that we need to think of alternative ways of acting, not just prefiguratively, but even, or at least holding our states or our leaders accountable to some of the decisions that they take. And I think pacifism, again, as a critical vantage point at this stage, can offer a lot, right? We gave a few examples. Military budgets, which will have significant impact on the economy, I suppose, in the coming years. And in general, I think what needs to be challenged is some of the discourse that we hear from NATO officials or Western leaders, because these can become self-fulfilling prophecies if we're.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you could give one message to these policymakers or global leaders, um, about prefigurative pacifism, what what would your one message be? Would it? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose my message would be to. That's a tough question. My message would be to think about what the implications of some of the decisions that they're taking might be long term, and to think about what might such an increase in military budget lead to if we're only doing it to defer. And because once the money are spent, these weapons
It feels like
just
it's
gonna stay.
almost inevitable that if we spend this money on the military, that we'll use it. Yeah. And then, okay, my last question, which I'm not sure I told you about before, would be if you had any like book recommendations or anything if people wanted to to read anything else about prefigurative pacifism?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily about prefigurative pacifism, but more. So it's a book. Let me just pull it up. I think it's yeah. So it's a book written by the first woman to win the Peace Nobel Prize. She's Austrian. In the English translation is Lay Down Your Arms, and it's written by Bertha von Suttner. And it's a novel. It's not necessarily a philosophy book, but it's a novel kind of the protagonist in the novel is a woman whose husband has went to war, and it goes over the psychological traumas, if you wish, of war and the kind of effects of war, which are not necessarily talked about purely on the immediate circle, but also societally. So I think it's a good book for written in 1893, I believe, 1889 actually, even earlier than that. But after writing that book, von Suttner, she became involved in a lot of pacifist movements across Europe. And she ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think it's a good read for the environment in which we live in today, to perhaps show people or remind people the horrors of violence.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that note, thank you. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. No worries. And thank you for the invitation. Some of the questions were quite difficult, so I hope I
Well,
didn't manage to answer them. Yeah.
thank you.